Bueno, vamos a empezar, que ya llevamos mucho retraso y nos deben de estar, bueno, de momento no mucha gente. Espérate, vamos a hacer una cosa, escúchame, porque ese nombre no lo cuelo. Bravo. ¿Se oye bien todo, más o menos? ¿No repite? Vale, perfecto. Bueno, pues hoy, como vemos también por el público, es la última sesión de este año. Estamos ya un poquito ya a final de curso. Yo he intentado movilizar también a algunos alumnos del grado, pero era un poquito tarde. Pero de todas maneras, está bien. Es simplemente una satisfacción llegar. Y a pesar de las circunstancias y de todo lo que hemos pasado este año, y hemos podido estar trabajando en este espacio, primero con un espacio muy restringido, ahora ya lo que nos obligaba a tener todo este sistema, ahora que ya controlamos mejor la tecnología, ya ahora finalmente podemos tener más gente y es cuando menos gente hay. Pero bueno, no ocurre nada. This afternoon we have with us two colleagues. From University of Padova. They are linked with a research project from the European Research Council, Republic and Risk. The name is Risk, the project you have there. I suppose you are going to speak about. No? The title is The Republics of the States of Kings, Representing Republic and State Power in the European of Absolutist Monarchies. No? It's a very interesting project, really very related with our project. We study Rex Publica about the Spanish monarchy as a composite structure, imperial structure of urban republics. So we have a strong dialogue. We have a first meeting during the pandemic, absolutely all online, a seminar titled Questioning Republics in Early Modern Genoa in December 2020. And we begin to have a strong collaboration. We are going to have another seminar now in Padova in May with people from the two projects. The analysis of them, I think you are going to explain better than me, is a multidisciplinary campus of sources now, because there is a dialogue between literature studies, cultural studies, intellectual art studies, history, and also the objective is to find a kind of alternative genealogy of absolutism and putting the role of the republics in this dialogue with the monarchies. So something really related with the thing we are doing. No, the next activity you are preparing is something about Tacito alla lettera. No, is the study of the citation of Tacito in the political literature in the 17th century. Is going to be in February 2022. And okay, now we are going to begin with one of the members of this seminar. We have decided it's so related the two parts of the seminar, so we are going to take both presentation at the beginning. After we are going to have a break, and after we are going to have all the discussion, because it's a case study related with a general topic. They are going to to present something really linked. No, Enrico Zucchi did his PhD in the Università of Padova in 2017. And he's a specialist in 17 and 18 European theater, and also in the Accademia dell'Arcadia. You have wrote something. He passed some period in Université Sorbonne Paris 4 with a group of history of théâtre, and histoire du théâtre comparé à l'époque moderne, choses comme ça. And he have write a lot of paper related with these things. No, I think you are going to present something. Yes, is going to be published recently. I suppose a Republican in comparison. I know this article in History of European Ideas is comparison between the case study you study in the Risk project. No, is Venice, Genoa, Lucca, Ragusa, and also the Dutch Republic. And you have other papers I don't going to speak about. And you have the floor, Enrico, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Manuel. Thank you all for the wonderful presentation, for the very warm welcoming. Thank you very much. I will dive immediately into the subject. The first question from which I moved when I started working on the culture of 17th century Republic of Genoa, once I became a member of the Risk project, my topic is specifically the Republic of Genoa. The first question was this: what we think about when we think about early modern republicanism. When you approach such an issue from a scholarly perspective, it is almost impossible that the first books you handle, the first ideas that comes to your mind, are not those spread by the Cambridge School of Intellectual History. Books such as Pocock, The Machiavellian Moment, or Quentin Skinner's Liberty Before Liberalism, published in the last 30 years and drawn in dozens of volumes and articles by historians of the Renaissance political thought, have deeply colonized our mind to the extent that when we think about early modern republicanism, we imagine a shared European heritage as the subtitle of a book published in 2005. In the opinion of several scholars, republicanism is a long-lasting political tradition based on a strict set of well-defined political ideas, which includes, for instance, the claim for unconditioned liberty and the radical hostility to the monarchical constitution, established in the 5th century Athens, then inherited in the Republican Rome, and assumed in Machiavelli Florence, Cromwell's England, and in the Constitution of the United States. The aim of these scholars was that of demonstrating that extraordinary resilience of this Republican project, prior and stronger than those of liberalism or absolutism. Yet this fascinating idea of a tough and durable political tradition that survives almost continuously identical from the ancient Greece to the French Revolution, argued mostly in reference to two limited case studies, that of Soderini's Florence and of Milton's London, appears far less convincing when we deal with a variety of texts produced in 16th and 17th century Italian republics. Some scholars in recent years, following also the suggestion of Franco Venturi, yesterday we talked about this a little bit, some scholars in recent years, following also the suggestion of Franco Venturi, have questioned the worth of Pocock's and Skinner's vision. Gabriele Pedulla, for example, a literary scholar whose research focused on 15th and 16th century Florence, has pointed out that as far as the Florentine case is concerned, the historians belonging to the Cambridge School have forced the medieval and Renaissance text into an over-modernizing conceptual framework, showing how, in fact, Florentine political ideas in those years are characterized by a weak republicanism, very different from the strong republican theory that will emerge only later. Manuel Herrero Sanchez and you all, historians at the Universidad Pablo Olavide in Sevilla, have demonstrated that it doesn't exist a concrete ideological conflict between monarchies and republics in the early modern Europe, to the point that the Spanish Empire seems a sort of monarchical republic, wherein the sovereignty is fragmented and polycentric. Following this trail, I've tried in these years to survey Genoese, but also Dutch and Venetian 17th century political literature in relation to three cornerstones of the interpretative path of Cambridge republicanism, that are the total ideological contrast to the monarchical constitution, the claim for radical liberty, according to which every form of subjectude is equivalent to servitude, the exclusive drawing of ancient Roman authors as political models. In my paper, I will try to discuss some case studies that I've examined in this year in order to prove that the early modern political culture is far less black and white than that described by the Cambridge School, that Genoese political thought generally was not anti-monarchical at all, that 17th century political works produced in Republican context were deeply influenced by early modern sources, much more than ancient ones, and that often these sources conveyed absolutist ideas. The very first element that led us to question the idea of a strong, deeply rooted ideological contrast to the monarchical government in 17th century Italian republics is located in the Republican constitution themselves. It seems very hard to argue that Genoa, Venice, or Amsterdam even are characterized by a fervent harvest at hatred towards the absolutist state, when their constitution introduced on purpose figures that belong to the royal policy. Gasparo Contarini, de Magistratibus et Republica Venetorum, argued that the strength of the Venetian political system resided in the fact that it was mixed, requiring a democratic component, the Maggior Consiglio, an aristocratic element, that of the consigli and other delegates, and a monarchical one, the Doge. In the Dutch federal system, where the States General ruled in agreement with the Prince Stadtholder, this compresence of a monarchical compound constitutionally established appears even more evident. The cases of Genoa and Venice are, of course, much different from that of Florence and London, since we are not dealing with newborn republics created after a revolution against the previous king, but with older and more complex political entities that had a long history behind them. But the fact is that when people in 16th and 17th century referred to contemporary republics, they have more often in mind Venice and Genoa, and later the United Province, much more than Florence or London, which were republics just for a little period. And it is a little bit anachronistic to think that Machiavelli's Florence was the emblem of Renaissance Republic only because some of the political theories there spread were maybe ideologically more alike to a post-French Revolution democracy. But after this general consideration, let me take a closer look at the Genoese 17th century political culture, examining the circulation of books that supported the idea according to which monarchy was the best form of government. We understand that Genoa was not anti-monarchical at all. On the contrary, the Doge and other eminent protagonists of the Republican life promoted the translation and the publication of several absolutist treatises. In 1588 appeared in Genoa the Italian translation of Jean Baudin's 6 livres de la République, maybe the most representative book of 16th century absolutist political theory, made by Lorenzo Conti with an official dedication to the Doge Davide Vacca. This was the first translation ever of the work of Baudin that had been just published a dozen of years before, 1576. In the dedication, Conti, rather than underlining that Baudin's predilection for the absolute monarchy is contrary to the Republican culture, celebrates the sharpness of the French writer and considers the book particularly useful to a Doge. In his opinion, the Republic of Genoa seems not so different to the French kingdom. It is still a princedom, but even more refined since its leader, like you can see in the extract, is not chosen by the fate, as it happens for a prince of blood, but elected by his fellow citizens. In the same years, another eminent citizen of the Republic of Genoa, Ambrogio Spinola, who was still at that time a very relevant politician of his homeland, promoted the translation of 2 other absolutist treatises. I am alluding to Philippe de Comines' memoir, published in the Italian version in 1594, and to Pedro de Ribadeneira's Tratado de la Religión y virtudes que debe tener el príncipe cristiano para gobernar y conservar sus estados. Published in Genoa in Italian in 1598, only 3 years after the Spanish Princeps. Both the two works share a clear absolutist view, since the first is a description of the heroic deeds of the French king Louis XIV, and the second is a sort of Christian rephrasing of Machiavelli's Prince. In a few words, the translation and circulation of these kinds of works prove the curiosity of the Genoese political elites toward the absolutist literature, rather than testifying the clear-cut otherness to the monarchical culture of the Genoese republicanism. Nobody at that time had the belief that those treatises were not suitable for a republican policy such as Genoa. These 3 were just books that gave concrete insights on the contemporary political government, so they were very useful, much more than the history of Livy, wrote Conti in his dedication, for the contemporary ruling class of each sort of policy. Apart from the translation, the 17th century Genoa proved its interest toward these books, supporting an absolutist culture also in other ways, such as the book collecting. Thanks to the works of some literary historians and bibliographers, we can now affirm that one of the best sellers of the time that could not be left over the libraries of the most powerful Genoese patricians was Lipsius' Politicorum Libris Sex. In the political work of Lipsius, monarchy was considered with no doubt the best policy, much more well-structured and fairer than the Republic. Still, in Genoa, where lived for a while Peter Paul Rubens, Lipsius' pupil, it was commonly read and appreciated. We can even find some extracts of the Politicorum in the 1589 print that included 1 year later in the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, instantly translated by Lorenzo Conti in his version of Comines Memoir. Moreover, entering on the field of diplomacy and of political representation so well explored by your research group, 17th century Italian republics were not so reluctant to exhibit, together with their republican status, also a sort of royal aura. Actually, they strove to represent themselves as monarchies. In the scenario of the Baroque Europe, the stage of kings, as Alessandro named it while elaborating the RISC project, the small republics of Genoa and Venice pretended to be constitutionally identical to the great European absolutist regime in order to gain prestige and not to have the worst position in the diplomatic order of precedence according to the 17th century ceremonial. It was not only a matter of form. Without the claim for royal possession outside the territorial domain of the Republic, they were not considered actors of the European diplomatic agenda. For this reason, Venice vigorously defended the possession of little reigns in the Mediterranean. The War of Candia bravely fought against the much stronger Turkish enemy with a disproportionate expenditure, was not battled only to maintain a little possession in the fair Isle of Crete. The royal status of Venice was at stake. Still, in the dedication to the Doge of the time, Giovanni Pesaro, of Galeazzo Gualdo Priorato's Scena d'Uomini Illustri, a volume containing literary portraits of great Italian captains, politicians, and writers, published at the age of the War of Candia, 1659, there are several allusions to the royal status of Venice. Here, the Doge is described has a crowned head. His behavior appears nothing less than regal, and Venice is defined a princedom. I have highlighted some words that testifies the monarchical, the absolutist vocabulary. Public majesty, the splendor, the majesty, the prudence, the clemency, the crown, the princedom, the father. All attributes referred to the Doge. Something very similar appeared in those years in Genoa, a little bit earlier, we are 1630, 1640, in Genoa, that was often represented as a sort of Christian monarchy ruled by the Virgin Mary, considered the Queen of Genoa. But this issue was not only an artistic topos reproduced by several painters and sculptors, such as Domenico Fiasella. Here you have a couple of examples. It also entailed a precise political claim. So let's go to the second point of my paper, the claim for radical liberty. Quentin Skinner, in his important book, Liberty Before Liberalism, dealing with the English Republic of Cromwell during the interregnum, stated that republicanism was characterized by the claim for unlimited liberty. According to Skinner, recalling themselves to some juridical and historical ancient sources, such as the Roman Digest and, again, Livy's historiography, 17th century English authors elaborated a radical interpretation of liberty within republican state, defining liberty in opposition to the concept of slavery. In the Roman sources and in the books of Harrington and his contemporary, every limitation of personal liberty, Skinner assumes, is a sort of slavery. So, republic is the only form of government where there is freedom, there is liberty, because there are no subjects. In order to support his thesis, Skinner mentions an exchange between Thomas Hobbes and James Harrington. This exchange was focused on the concept of liberty. According to Thomas Hobbes, a citizen of the small republic of Lucca could not claim to have more liberty than a subject of the Constantinople Sultan, since what counted was not the source of liberty that came from a king or from a republican senate, but its extension. And to the Turkish citizens, it was allowed to do pretty the same things that a citizen of Lucca could do. Harrington, on the contrary, argued that the poorest citizen of the Lucca Republic had far more liberty than the Constantinople's Pasha, the second highest imperial leader, since this one, the last one, the Pasha, living in a monarchy, was subject of a king that could do whatever he wanted with his subordinates. However, in 17th century Venice and Genoa, it is very difficult to find analogous expression and a similar drastic wish for absolute liberty. These two Italian republics were commonly considered at the time a sort of aristocracy or oligarchies wherein the liberty was not universal and without restrictions. This excerpt, taken from Tommaso Campanella's Discorsi della Libertà, well defines what the republican liberty was considered at the time. Here Campanella has the clear perception that the Aristotelian and Neo-Roman liberty has nothing in common with the republican liberty of policy such as the contemporary Genoa or Venice, where slavery was not banished at all. It is very clear in Campanella's view, you can see it from this excerpt, that Genoa and Venice were ruled by a small elite and a large part of the citizens were their subjects. What Genoese early modern authors intend when they refer to liberty seems instead something notably different from the absolute individual liberty, or better, the absence of restrictions to personal freedom. The liberty they claim for their republic, the liberty they celebrate in Genoa, is the autonomy from the other foreign powers. The history of medieval and early modern Genoa, and you of course know this very well, is full of tensions with the neighboring monarchies. The life of the Republic passed always through a negotiation of its autonomy, of its independence with this more powerful political entity. Already in the Middle Ages, Genoa had ambiguous relationship with the Holy Roman Empire, and thanks to the ability of its diplomacy, it succeeded to obtain a privileged political status, preserving its liberty, that is to say, its autonomy. Marie-Louise Farolilly described the 14th and 15th century Genoa in this term. It was de jure an imperial city, but de facto it was almost completely devoid of obligation. Even during the reign of Charles V in the 16th century, thanks to the precious work of Andrea Doria, Genoa managed to preserve its liberty. It was, as suggested by Matthias Schnettger, a civitas imperialis, somehow formally part of the empire, and by virtue of this status secured from the expansionistic aim of the French reign, but it held back its autonomy, its liberty. In the 17th century, when Genoese politicians or men of letters evoke the concept of liberty, they almost always allude to the independency from interference of foreign monarchies in the Republican political life. Ansaldo Cebà, Il cittadino di Repubblica, a political treatise published in 1617 by one of the most appreciated Genoese authors of his time, very close to the Spinoza's family and to the Republicistas party, the political faction whose program was characterized by the strong claim for political autonomy, argues that in order to preserve its liberty, Genoa should be free from the political influences of both the Spanish and the French monarchies. This is liberty for Genoa. The perfect Republican citizen, according to Cebà, is the one who struggles for his homeland's political independence. In his work that maybe presents the most radical political vision at that time, we cannot find any allusion to a liberty intended as a complete individual emancipation from authority, or even as the total lack of obligation due to the subjecthood. Even in another pamphlet that assumed a very critical position against the Genoese Republican government, titled Le malattie politiche della Repubblica di Genova, written by Gaspare Squarciafico, a Genoese nobleman sentenced to exile for political reasons, the idea of liberty displayed is pretty the same. According to his metaphorical diagnosis of the political body of the Republic, Genoa's illnesses that led it at that time almost at the point of death were caused by the lack of liberty due to the strict and ambiguous relationships with the two powerful neighboring monarchies. Another detractor of the Genoese political strategy, Pietro Pomo, official historiographer at the court of Ferdinand III in Vienna, mocked the pretended liberty, that means, again, political autonomy of the Republic of Genoa, and said that its difficult balancing in foreign policy in fact made it slave of two opposite monarchies. Con ostentazione di libertà serve ad ambedue. In Pomo's words, we can find again the conflict between liberty and servitude evoked by Harrington. But this contrast is not centered on individual liberty, but on political independence from other policies. The personal subjecthood is never at stake, since Genoese citizens commonly admitted to be subject, at best, of the Genoese Senate, at worst, of Spanish or French Empire. And so, let's pass to the last point, the last of the 3 points here examined that concerns the choice of sources. According to these scholars, to the Cambridge scholars, early modern republicanism is based on the drone of Aristotelian ideas or of the Roman authors, such as an interpretative scheme has been often referred also to the Genoese and Venetian Renaissance text, particularly stressing the aim of this republic to represent themselves as the legitimate modern heir of the classical Athens or of the ancient republican Rome. As far as the Genoese case is concerned, some scholars pointed out that the political treatise published within the borders of the Ligurian Republic in the first decades of the 17th century continued to raise issues drawn by Plutarch, Livy, Sallust, and Cicero. Ceba, il cittadino di Repubblica, according to their view, with its nostalgic classicism, is a perfect sample of this neo-Roman political theory, since it contains several allusions to these ancient authors, and it does not, they say, take any original position or make any reference to early modern political theories. What these scholars assume is that there were 2 different opposite traditions of political thought that had nothing in common. The first was the Republican one, based on the celebration of Aristotelian or Roman virtue and on the drone of ancient sources. The other was the absolutist one, based on the principle of the reason of state and derived from 16th and 17th century political treatises. Unfortunately, this black and white scenario is a critical anachronistic simplification that do not correspond to the political culture of the early modern period. If we look thoroughly at Ceba's treatise, for example, it's easy to get that the quotation from the Latin sources often hide a second and more precise reference to a modern author, very well known in Genoa at that time, whose work was based on the quotation and commentary of ancient sources. And I'm alluding, of course, to Lipsius and his Politicorum Libris Sex. The prototype of the perfect republican citizen shaped in Ceba's book perfectly matches with the portrait of the ideal sovereign sketched out by Lipsius in his volume. For both of them, the final aim of their political action is to achieve the common good. Both of them should be directed in their activism by the same values that are justice, clemency, and modesty. They both have to be generous with their own money in favor of the collectivity, but without being wasteful. They both have to keep well away from the extreme parsimony. They both should have a humanistic education, know well ancient and modern history and philosophy, read poetry, speak or at least understand several foreign idioms. Mostly, they both have to take obsessively care of their individual reputation that should be perfectly clean, since they need to collect the general and enthusiastic consensus of subjects and citizens. As it can be easily argued, more than listing a series of virtues taken from Latin historiography, Ceba, who read well Lipsius' work, is here modeling his republican citizen on the description of the perfect prince made by the Dutch writer. Virtues such as clemency and magnificence indeed did not belong to the ancient republican tradition. They are part of the absolutist early modern pantheon of qualities demanded to the king. And it is very remarkable the fact that Ceba requires to his republican citizen those assets. This is, according to my opinion, the clear evidence that early modern republican culture normally derived portion of its political discourse from the absolutist imagery. And consequently, the highly compartmentalized representation of the two different cultures, conflictual and never in contact, turns out to be mistaken. I have almost concluded. Many other signs of hybridation of contemporary absolutist writing in Republican 17th century works can be found also looking outside the Genoese case. If we look at Venice, we can find a deep penetration, for example, of Hobbes' thesis in several 17th century political texts. Let us examine, for example, the already mentioned dedication of Gualdo Prioratos' Scena d'Uomini Illustri to the Doge Pesari. Here, the entire Venetian political body, the whole assembly of common people and patricians, is identified with the head of the Doge, whose will naturally mirrors that of his people, quanta gran parte risegga nel loro che è il medesimo che dire nel vostro capo. It is hard to find, even in a monarchical contemporary context, a more evident allusion to one of the central ideas of the Leviathan. In conclusion, what emerges from this survey is that the categories established by the Cambridge School of Intellectual History to read the European phenomenon of early modern republicanism are not suitable to interpret correctly the political culture of republics such as Genoa or Venice. The Genoese case is very peculiar, it's true, because of some geopolitical causes that cannot be overlooked while examining the political production of the time. It was historically linked to great absolutist policies, being first a civitas imperialis during the Holy Roman Empire, and then a peripheric center of the polycentric Spanish monarchy. But if we want to examine the Genoese, maybe also the Venetian case, juxta propria principia, we have first to admit that early modern republicanism was a very complex phenomenon that can be hardly reduced to an homologating formula. In this period, Italian republics are continuously negotiating their identity, which is for sure a weak identity, to the extent that in the second part of the 17th century, when the absolutism was dominant in Europe, they consider strengthening the monarchical component of their constitution, as I have showed in a previous article recently published and mentioned very kindly also by Manuel on the journal History of European Ideas. Here you can find other articles that are already published or almost published in press. If you need something, if you are interested also in have the draft copy, please write me. I will be very glad to send you all this material. Thank you very much for your attention.